I want to introduce our next speaker, who I have to tell you, I don't know how to thank her, because we were in a tight bind, and due to, I won't explain, unforeseen circumstances, I called dear Dr. Ghanea, and I said if she would please consider speaking at this conference. And she was most gracious and most supportive, and to have her do the things she needed to do with family pressures, work pressures, she agreed to come. And so we are indebted to her for this amazing ability to take care of everything and to still be with us. And I will assure you that you will be happy that this happened and that she accepted to be here because of the work that she does and her area of scholarship. Professor Nazila Ghanea is Associate Professor of International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford and an Associate of the Oxford Human Rights Hub. She serves as a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief, and Board of Governors of the Universal Rights Group, the editor board of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion, and the Board of Trustees of Iran Academia. She has authored, co-authored, and edited a number of academic papers and United Nations publications, including Religion or Belief, Britain in Global Context, and another book, Human Rights, the United Nations, and the Baha'is in Iran. Please welcome to the podium Professor Nazila Ghanea.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Professor Mahmoudi, for the invitation, and thank you for staying back. I'm sure you want to beat the traffic and get back home, so I'll keep it short. I thought it would be useful, after the very rich and varied presentations we've had over the past 2 days, 2.5 days, to bring one other lens or one other insight onto the table. To be honest, it has been raised by at least 2 other speakers, but let's have a more focused discussion now about human rights law. And my purpose is to ask us to look at reimagining human rights, or more narrowly, to have a look at the human rights system and particularly treaty obligations, and see whether these are delivering on our expectations, maybe as Professor Mitchell would have put it, our aspirations regarding human rights. Is it doing that? And what is the relationship and contribution that could make to peace? Now, we've already had such a rich variety of insights from what is the role of equality, what about raising moral questions at universities, the insights of education, architecture and design, the UN, the Women's Global Movement, governance, constructive resilience, behavioral sciences, environmental sciences. We've had a whole lot. So now the issue of human rights law in a more focused way. We've also heard in the past few days about this very sharp distinction that we have to draw between negative peace and positive peace. And I wouldn't be talking about human rights law if I wasn't more concerned with positive peace. Negative peace being the end of war, the announcement or achievement of a ceasefire, and positive peace, as Johann Galtung put back in 1996, as including far greater objectives of restoration of relationships, creation of social systems, etc., and also human rights. So I'm looking more at the positive peace. Not to say that human rights is irrelevant to the prevention of war or the negotiation of ceasefires. Of course, it may have a role there too. But in terms of prevention, it's more easily housed under positive peace. The OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, for example, sees this mandate that has been running for some decades. It came out of the Helsinki Accords, if you know its history. This mandate is exactly about delivering human rights in order to prevent war. So the High Commissioner on National Minorities works behind the scenes to de-escalate and to diffuse tensions arising around minority communities and their demands that could spark into war. So there is this integral relationship between human rights, the prevention of war, negative peace, but more fittingly, positive peace. So I'm going to focus more, when we talk about human rights, we could be talking about human rights longings at the human level, at the domestic level, as again the previous speaker might have put more focus on. What are the yearnings of individuals and what are the commonalities, but also what are the differences between these yearnings and the language in which people would articulate this. So we could be talking about human rights at the domestic level, at the psychological level. We could be talking about the national level or regional level or international level. But I'm going to, in order to make it manageable, focus most on the United Nations human rights standards that we have developed over the last 70 years. And this inclusion of human rights in the UN project itself coming about in the aftermath of a Second World War, at least in the European and Western context. Of course, we have had thousands of wars, and who are we to say that these were the world wars, not others? But in any case, in the common language that we use, a Second World War, and of course, after a Holocaust that shocked the conscience of mankind and continues to do so. So it was in the aftermath of great misery and great suffering of war and those that had taken advantage of the chaotic context of war that finally, the bleeding limbs of mankind at that moment decide that we must have an international organization that will prevent such an occurrence happening again. The UN Charter itself reflects this comprehensive, Professor Mahmoudi calls it the complex issue of peace, but this comprehensive approach towards peace is in the charter of this organization that is decided on the aftermath of war. And it brings together, you might think this is the immediate aftermath of war. These are allies that are striking an uneasy truce in terms of values. They've just been at each other's throats for years before this. Yet they have this comprehensive understanding that we cannot only aim at peace and security. We need to also look at development and human rights. And this is something that a number of organizations and UN Secretary Generals have referred to as the 3 pillars of the United Nations. So, I'm not saying the UN Charter is the greatest articulation of peace ever, but even in the aftermath of war and such suffering and distrust, we realize that it takes more than security to build a world of peace. We need development, we need human rights. And so this is from Article 1 of the UN Charter, that the aims and objectives of the United Nations is to maintain international peace and security. I suppose maintain is quite an impoverished idea, but in any case, at least to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperation, and something of a surprise, something that took a lot of lobbying by many NGOs, some of whom had been active at least since the early 1900s, but as a result of that lobbying, then also the promotion and encouragement of respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So, over the decades, a UN system develops that has sister agencies focused on particular aspects of the UN's work, for example, in relation to children or health or labor, But the UN more narrowly itself has different bodies, some of which are controlled by the veto power of a few, others that have equal representation of all states. It has a secretariat. There's a complex system. But more narrowly, it also has a human rights system that develops over time. And we describe this human rights system as primarily having two arms. One draws directly from the Charter and the Charter's vision for human rights and all the organizations and institutions that develop out of that ambition, that one of the objectives of the United Nations should be human rights. And secondly, there's a whole other sort of universe of human rights that develops from different treaties. So states go to the negotiating table. There's an impulse to draft a new treaty, let's say, for persons with disabilities. They struggle over the drafting and the language, and they develop a treaty, and then there is the obligation to that treaty. So states are freely entering into obligations under a treaty, not only out of being, members of the UN and from the UN Charter, but also they are additionally committing themselves to treaties. And I want to focus mainly on these human rights treaties and how they operate and what glimpse they give us on how far we are able to achieve human rights and therefore contribute in that way to peace. What are the strengths, achievements, but also limitations of where we currently stand in relation to UN treaties? Before we had treaties, and as one of the first tasks of a new body created through the UN Charter, there was a Commission on Human Rights, and its first task, it took it upon itself to draft a non-binding declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I will come back to these two articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as being a sort of a pattern of our ambition for what we want from human rights, or what we drafted at that time as being an expression of our hopes for human rights. And that is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Secondly, that everyone, Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction, without any distinction, okay? So I wouldn't call these values. I think values have their own role. I think religion has its own role and has a different project. Of course, there might be overlapping consensus between values, religion and human rights, but I wouldn't want to call what is pronounced by states in the aftermath of great misery, and then trying to reflect a document that will bring us together as being the highest articulation of our values. But in any case, I think there are ethical impulses behind how we came here. But these were the modest, after all, articulations of what we want of human rights, that this is now a document that reflects a yearning that poets and novelists and writers and religious personalities for centuries in many parts of the world, in different cultures, have expressed in their own diverse languages and means. But the synthesis of it is that we are born free and equal, we are equal in dignity, and we should enjoy some minimum standards without distinction. Not the highest standards, but some minimum standards that we could operationalize and deliver to everybody around the world. This was our ambition. This is what we said in 1948. Where are we at with trying to implement that around the world? Now, I'd worked, I suppose I've always been interested in the question of how rights get implemented and enjoyed. Some people lose themselves in the language of rights. Are they universal, the morality of it, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, each to their own, and that's wonderful. But I've always been more concerned with, yes, if we have these claims, then how are they being enjoyed, whether in Iran or whether, on the question of religion. belief in England and Wales. So, you know, I think that's something that has grabbed me. And we have these international standards that we develop over the decades. We have developed over the decades. We have 10 United Nations human rights treaties. I'm going to set aside all the other mechanisms and institutions and just focus on these treaties. What is interesting about treaties is that they are legally binding, they are legal obligations. States enter into these commitments themselves freely. Now, I put freely, of course, they might be deeply encouraged, there might be trade and aid, and you know, there might be other arm twisting or persuasion behind it, but ultimately, the state can say no. And it's interesting, I think it would have been far beyond the vision of any of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or those that sat around the table at Dumbarton Oaks to bring the UN into being, that states would go to the trouble of adding to their own burdens and something as sensitive as human rights. They would freely enter multiple treaties to bring themselves to account legally to be bound by standards that have been you know, decided at the international level, and they are entering into this reporting cycle and legal obligation. They've entered a legal realm that they could have kept out of. And, you know, states, of course, have plenty to be getting on with and many demands on their time, and now they are entering into an international arena of legal accountability. That was not envisaged. So, you know, that's the glass half full picture, you know. So it's a remarkable achievement. But is it delivering on Article 1 and 2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Remains to be seen. And these are the 10 treaties that we have, the binding legal treaties that are dedicated to human rights, okay? So there are thousands of treaties at every level, all over, that have human rights clauses. I've put them aside. These are United Nations treaties exclusively concerned with human rights, okay? So civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, women's rights, child rights, prohibiting torture and becoming, the state becoming ready to always be sent investigators at any time to look at all places where torture might occur and reporting on that. Then disappearances, disabilities, and racism. These are the 10 treaties we have developed over the decades. Over the past 4 decades, to be precise. And when a state ratifies, commits itself legally, not signs, but then ratifies a treaty, then they enter this cycle of accountability. So usually 2 years after they ratify a treaty, they have to report on what progress they're making towards the implementation of that treaty. So it's not as if you get a pat on your back because, Soveda, you signed this treaty, well done. You then enter a cycle of accountability. So let alone the fact that people within your state might start saying, look, you committed yourself to this, we need to see progress here. But also at the international level, there is supervision by treaty committees that will regularly receive reports from you. And they won't just receive your report on how well you're doing on the prohibition of torture, they will be receiving reports from non-government organizations that hopefully are not gongos paid by you or under the control of the state, but are independent organizations that see things from the ground and are reporting. And you bring together, the experts are receiving those shadow reports, the state's reports, and they are constantly reviewing implementation of these legal obligations, let's say, in relation to ending discrimination on the grounds of race or discrimination against women. So the state has entered what legally is quite an onerous obligation. They don't always see it like that or behave like that, but it is, you know, if only they knew. And the expert committee, the treaty committee, is a body of independent experts, and they will receive your report, they will receive you, and then they will, it's called a state dialogue, but sometimes it can be quite a grilling about, well, you say you did this, but we've heard about the Roma in your country, we've heard about the migrants that have just come, what about their education? What are you doing about what's happening in you know, your fringe territories where there is conflict? You still have obligations there. So it's hard to escape their notice. They will demand data, disaggregated data, to get a full picture. And if you don't give it to them as a state, they will go and find it elsewhere and ask you to account for that. So this is the treaty world of reporting that they enter into. Now, so a couple of us, with a colleague of Professor Mitchell, decided that we want to look at how this is working in 6 of the 193 states of the world. And I grew up in Qatar. My parents went there in the mid-60s, so I had familiarity with that country, and with a Turkish colleague, we initiated this research project to look at what are the domestic effects of United Nations treaty ratification on the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. So that's, Qatar is getting a lot of mention in the last 75 minutes. I don't think that happens at a lot of international conferences that are not dedicated to area studies. It has a domestic population of citizens of about 250,000, but so they're getting good airtime in this conference as it happens. But the Gulf Cooperation Council states are Qatar, Oman, not in any order, Qatar, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. And they entered a political, they created this regional organization in the 80s, and they have some commonalities, but also many differences. But what you observe when you look at the UN Human Rights Treaty ratifications and these 6 states is that the number of ratifications went up in the 1990s. That's not the only time where there were ratifications, but it was a significant ratification surge. So along with colleagues at Georgetown University, Qatar, and Qatar University, we started this research project over 2 years that ended last year. So it reminds us of the question of why do states ratify treaties anyway? Is it because of international pressure, or is it because of a sense of the cultural norm being that you must ratify human rights treaties, okay? These are the international factors, so there might be pressure on you to ratify, or you could feel that it is the norm, it is expected of a state, of a modern state, that you should ratify human rights treaties. And secondly, there are domestic reasons why a state might ratify human rights treaties. It might be that aid is made conditional on it. For example, if you want to join the European Union, you have to ratify the European Convention on Human Rights. So there are ways in which there is some kind of coercion, or there's a necessity of ratification for certain countries. There might be domestic pressure that, for example, it doesn't always succeed. As we heard, there has been a 40-year effort to get the United States to ratify CEDAW, but there might be domestic pressure and calls for ratification. And it might be that a new leader comes and wishes to ratify. So what's happening in these 6 states? It was the first time, we went through hundreds of research papers and publications on the GCC states, and we found that around 3% of them even mention human rights, and of those, there are really less than half a dozen papers that engage with the question of human rights treaty ratification in these states. So it's an understudied area, to put it mildly. Of course, there are many publications on the Gulf region on many, looking at different questions, but human rights is not front and center. And so we couldn't rely just on the scholarly literature. We carried out around 70 interviews with representatives from the 6 states. We held 2 workshops, and we researched and analyzed around 120 UN documents. So what is happening with ratification in the GCC? The first ratification is that by Kuwait, and it's in 1968. Then ratifications are almost non-existent, and then there is a coordinated effort to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child. There is an impulse to ratify the Convention Against Racism, mainly in the anti-apartheid mood of the region. CEDAW, the Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, comes much later, and the Migrant Workers Convention is not ratified by any of the 6 states. And it's hardly ratified by any of the European states for that matter, but considering that some of the Gulf states have more than 90% of their population are migrant workers, you might feel that there's a greater impulse. There should be a greater impulse to ratify, but actually it's a huge discouragement as well because of the demands it makes. But anyway, this is the ratification picture. So the Convention on Disappearances, first of all, the Convention Against Torture has been ratified, but not its stronger optional protocol that makes you ready to receive inspectors at any time, anywhere. It's not a popular thing for states to facilitate. Oman hasn't ratified the Convention Against Torture. Then the Convention on Disappearances is much newer, and none of them have ratified it. The Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and Civil and Political Rights is ratified by Bahrain and Kuwait, but not the others, and the Migrant Workers Convention is not ratified. Now, what power do states have? States, as we have just heard, first can decide whether to bother, whether to ratify a human rights treaty or not, okay? Having decided that, they then have another choice. Can they ratify it? Can they accept this legal obligation, but with reservations? That means we exclude, as a state, I wish to exclude or modify parts of the treaty and say that it doesn't apply to me, okay? Now, you'd say that's giving a lot of leeway to a state. They're entering a human rights obligation, but they're basically suspending part of it. Now, this is not completely unregulated. It shouldn't be against the spirit and purpose of that treaty. But yes, good luck. And the Gulf states have entered many reservations. So when they have ratified treaties, they have very specific reservations. Some of them have removed reservations that they initially lodged, which is a very healthy practice that the treaty committees are trying to encourage more widely. But we still see many reservations. That's the red. Then, what is the next option you have as a state? Do you ratify? Do you lodge reservations or not? The third option you have is how you engage with the reporting process at the United Nations committees in Geneva. So I've ratified the convention prohibiting torture. Then I'm bound to go and report about how my implementation is going, what challenges I'm facing, and these experts are in a great position to advise me. But out of 78 reports submitted until last year, 71 of them from the GCC states were late. 71 out of 78 were late. Only 7 were on time or early. Unfortunately, this is not unique to the GCC state. We are getting a snapshot from 6 states of 193, but I don't want to suggest that these are unusual. Some of them are more unusual. I mean, the fact that most of the ratifications are in the 90s, would be different in other parts of the world. But this delay in reporting, unfortunately, is very regular. There are other reporting processes. One of them is called Universal Periodic Review. We just used this as a contrast to see how the GCC states are engaging with human rights at the international level. And here we saw that although some of the states had not engaged with it by making recommendations for the improvement of other states' records, they were gradually starting to engage with the process. So that suggests some kind of buy-in at an engagement level as well. I don't want to overplay it. So standing back from this picture, what are some of the effects that we might expect to see in a country that has ratified human rights treaties? We might see a feedback effect that, states have got sucked into the human rights reporting system. They ratify, they become active on it, they think that this is a good thing, it persuades them to ratify more treaties, they report more regularly, they put forward names from their citizens to stand on these committees. I mean, there's different ways of getting involved in the system, and that feedback can be a very positive feedback. It can also be a negative feedback, that you ratify one treaty, you have a hard time being grilled in Geneva, and then you think, whoa, let's slow this down. We don't have the capacity or perhaps the good faith to be taking this forward. So that can go either way. Secondly, we might expect to see more domestic institutions dedicated to human rights, and that can be from human rights bureaus in different ministries, and my goodness, there are many in the Gulf, to national human rights institutions and possibly civil society organizations. You might expect that before entering into a legal commitment, the state will carry out a legal review to make sure that it will be compliant, and that once it is ratified, it will then keep reviewing and improving its legal compliance. But many states, funnily enough, don't do that at all, or decades after ratification, there's still a massive gap between their laws and what is being called for in human rights laws. And then it might be that the courts really become active in citing international standards and using it as arguments in deciding cases at the domestic level. Let's say nationality being passed through the mother. It's very helpful if you want to help nationality to go through the mother, including definitely in the Gulf states, to try and call for international standards and cases that support this. And it might be that domestic civil society becomes much more active. And I'll come back to whether the GCC states are showing these trends or not. But first, when they report in Geneva, what type of recommendations are they receiving from the committees, from the treaty committees? What are they recommending to them? See that about 50% of the recommendations coming to these states after reporting is calling for legal change. So the experts are still seeing a gap between the treaty that has been ratified by these 6 states, by each of these 6 states, of course, and the domestic law. There's the gap. Around 25% of the recommendations are for policy changes, and it's only a smaller, there's very few recommendations for capacity building, because actually, many of the Gulf states have money. They invest heavily in education, and even if they don't have the experts that are citizens, they can employ them from other countries. The Gulf states have also, a number of them have developed in these recent decades national human rights institutions. So these are independent bodies at the national level. They should be independent bodies that at the national level are encouraging the state to improve on its human rights record. Now, another insight into how active has civil society become in these states is, you can go around and look at the NGO laws in these countries and you won't get much encouraged. I mean, there are some very stern NGO laws. If you want to count the number of NGOs, then, there's a lot more to look at in Kuwait than the others, and Bahrain than the other 4 states. But another insight or snapshot into this is to see, are there civil society organizations sending shadow reports to Geneva? I said that when a country ratifies a treaty, then they have to report. When they report, the experts also invite civil society organizations to report so that they get a richer picture. So that, it's not just the state saying, I'm doing really great. It's also NGOs that are active on the ground and know the situation of child rights in the country reporting, so that I have this richer picture. What percentage of these reports are coming from the Gulf states? It's the purple here. A very small number of GCC NGOs are sending in shadow reports. And I can tell you, it's really Kuwait and Bahrain, and to a much smaller extent. There's one notable example from a group of Qatari concerned citizens for women's rights. That's definitely worth going to read. But, it's the vast majority of reports are international NGOs, which I think connects again to Professor Mitchell's talk that, to get good buy-in for human rights, for these international human rights standards to be alive and kicking and active, you would want there to be a lot more purple, so that it's people within the country that are working with these standards to translate them into what is meaningful at the domestic level, sequencing what is practical, a step-by-step approach towards realizing them. Now, some of the drivers for implementing human rights don't work so well in the GCC states. There isn't a lot of pressure from neighboring states to implement human rights. There is a reading, a sense by the states that it is a good thing to ratify human rights and to be seen to be active. That works. International NGO pressure, yes, you know, with the Qatar World Cup, or, you know, when there's a expo in Dubai, or, you know, occasionally these will be sort of kickstart, be drivers for organizing. But generally, the number of issues that have been dealt with by international NGOs regarding the GCC have centered around migrant rights, women's rights, and not many other issues. There isn't a good information base outside these countries, and there isn't good data, as I suggested. Are they under financial pressure? Are there trade agreements that the countries depend on that require them to ratify treaties or encourage? No, there aren't. And so, you know, some of these drivers that might work in, you know, the question of whether India ratifies or Brazil ratifies or Papua New Guinea ratifies are not effective in the GCC. So it's the international socialization, the domestic leadership, you know, the Vision 2020 Qatar, or is it 2025? I've forgotten. 25, yes. You know, there are domestic visions and leadership preferences that are more the drivers for the implementation of human rights than the international. So as a summary, it's the strong sense that this is what is expected from us, and a leadership preference that we need to be seen to be good in this area that operates, we saw reflected in Qatar and Oman. With Kuwait, it was more the cultural sense, and Saudi Arabia and UAE, and it's only in Bahrain that there's a domestic pressure calling for ratification of human rights standards. And we all know what has been happening in Bahrain in the past 7-8 years in particular. And what we didn't find in the Gulf states is many court cases that are making reference to the international human rights treaties. In fact, to be precise, we found, you know, a couple in Bahrain and a couple in Kuwait, and that's it. So the courts have are not resonating or taking up these international standards and running with them. We even found cases where the international reference could have been really useful. And we had this great interview with a lawyer in Qatar where he was handling the first sex change case of a woman, a woman who considered herself, you know, her birth certificate was a woman, he considered himself a man, he had carried out most of the operations towards transition and was living, you know, it's not like the US where you're a man in a woman's body classified as a woman. This is where you sit in the office, which parks you might go to on which day, your life chances, you know, what you need in order to leave the country, all of these things make a difference. Your male or female, what you're registered at is critical at every step of the way, from the day you know, from the stepping out of your door to every step. So we said, why aren't you making reference to international standards? There's some great cases from other countries that you might use. And he said, there's no way I'm going to do that. That will be to the disadvantage of my client. And we said, well, why? I mean, there's some good cases. And actually, this is a fairly clear case because you know, all the operations were nearly completed. And he said, it's much better for me to run on haram. It's haram it's, you know, it's a shame, religiously unacceptable to leave this person with an uncertain gender or with the wrong gender recognition. And he said that we're a small country. If I refer to international standards, it will come down like a ton of bricks for my clients. It will be counterproductive because I'm making reference to something foreign. It's much better to make a reference to a value, you know, a reference point that is comfortable so that the judge isn't scared off. So that was a very interesting insight. So this is a microcosm, and I'm going to finish in the next minute or two, Hoda, a microcosm of the global challenge. Now, it takes different shapes, it works in different ways in different parts of the world, But I would suggest that what is common is that it's completely state-centered. The language of the Universal Declaration and the ambition of this world of human rights that has developed over nearly 70 years is very global, cosmopolitan, inclusive, no distinction, even on grounds of citizenship and national origin. But in reality, your human rights fate depends on whether your state can be bothered to ratify or decides to ratify. If it ratifies, did it do so with reservations? Whether it is really engaged in conscientiously and continuously trying to implement these standards, whether it reports regularly and takes advantage of the expertise in Geneva to get feedback and encouragement and technical assistance where necessary, then whether it implements or takes seriously those recommendations and whether it engages in other processes. So, are we born free and equal in dignity and rights, or does it depend under which of these states, in which of these conditions we find ourselves? And are we all entitled to the rights and freedoms without distinction or not? This is, now let me remind you that I also said some positive things about human rights, that this even in, imagining that there would be so many treaties involved in so many details, all in a world where there is legal obligation and accountability that states freely enter into and then get sucked into this continuous reporting and inspection and review process. This is a far cry from what was imagined 70 years ago. Yet, what did we say? Free and equal in dignity and rights without distinction, okay? So we have made some progress, but we haven't achieved it. And if we contrast this with a vision in the Baha'i religious values of the oneness of humanity, we are also far short of what has been set forth in the Baha'i writings. In fact, this is from the Promise of World Peace, the 30th anniversary of which this conference is celebrating. So it's a statement by the Universal House of Justice of Baha'i values. And it says, world order can be founded only on unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind, a spiritual truth which all the human sciences confirm. And I think we went to many sciences in the last 2.5 days, which they confirmed, either they shared the vision or they confirmed that there is this vision of a oneness, that we should be equal in dignity and rights, and we should enjoy, we should all have human lives with as much opportunity as is possible for the world and the society to deliver for us at that time. And also that the acceptance of the oneness of mankind is the first fundamental prerequisite for reorganizing the world as one country. The language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is envisaging a world where the system is delivering equality without distinction. But the state-centered world that we are living in is putting a lot of conditions and restrictions on that. And therefore, I wanted us just to begin to reimagine a human rights that can deliver on that promise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghanea. If you would just please come up to the microphones and ask your questions, and I'm going to start with one. Fascinating research about the role of the nations, right, and their responsibilities that either they shirk or might take some responsibility for. How do you see, let's say, over the next decade or so, are we on a downward spiral when it comes to human rights issues?
I think Ms. Dugal, who is seeing this in New York in UN corridors, should perhaps answer this. But there are upward spirals and downward spirals, and there are steps back and steps forward, sometimes on different issues at the same time. So the popularity and support base on some issues will go up and some will go down, but There is a risk that human rights, states ratify human rights treaties, then they realize how onerous it is. And then if all states decide to shirk their responsibility or push back, there is the possibility in a state-centered system of human rights law that they will push back and they will dilute some of the standards. They will reinterpret it in such a consistent way over such a period of time that the standard is lowered in effect. So the legal text might remain the same, but its understanding can be diluted. I think it depends how you think social change happens. And on the one hand, the buy-in of the human rights legal system has increased. And there are institutions all over the world at the local level, at the regional level, everywhere dedicated to human rights. But I don't want to be naive about what they are delivering. On some rights, for example, we see suddenly a support for the ban of landmines, or there's a great momentum towards girls' education, or reducing, I won't say eliminating, child marriage, girls not brides, etc. So there are campaigns that are successful, but I think there's a lot of aggrieved people around the world that read the language and don't see the reality in their own lives. Where there is most hope is where there are coalitions, where there are civil society organizations, where people understand it. And I totally agree here with Professor Mitchell that we cannot just remain with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and just have this mantra of it is global. On the one hand, it's universal. On another hand, it really isn't. It depends which level we're talking about. But we need local supports for human rights. We need it to be localized, and there's a lot of sort of different theories around this. We need it to be grounded in reality in different communities. Otherwise, there will always be this large gap between the language and the reality. It's not a simple answer, Hoda, sorry.
I found myself during my UN career in Saudi Arabia, where I was to advise the government on how to promote the status of women. I was talking to women about human rights and their rights and freedom and all that. And I found really they were very severely looking at me, saying, what about our obligations? One woman told me, and who's going to take care of the kids? And my counterpart, who was a young princess, told me, you don't want us to be like American women? And I found it extremely difficult to answer to that. And I was telling him, I don't want you to be like American women. I want you to be what you want to be. And they'd say, we're very, very happy. We have our dignity. We are respected. And we have our religion. And we have our obligation to the law of God. And that is one of the arguments that many countries in the region would not sign the Declaration of Human Rights unless they told me, some high official, unless there is a Declaration of Human Obligation. Have you heard about such possibility?
For example, there was already in 1947 a Baha'i document putting forward the idea of obligations. But I think the problem is a greater one, is that when we say CEDAW, as we heard yesterday, when we say CEDAW in the US, people think, oh my gosh, this is a blank check to abortion. When we say CEDAW in Arab states, this means lesbians getting married. We reduce this document that could plug in and become meaningful with so many local ambitions and drivers, and we reduce it to one thing. So civil and political rights, it means, the democratic system, see what it did to Algeria. So, there's a lot of unattractive ways of portraying in a very impoverished way each of these treaties and their goals. And that's the problem, is that the treaties get overshadowed by a single picture. And CEDAW will not be meaningful, the Convention on the Rights of the Child will not be meaningful until it grapples with countries where there's a one-child policy and countries where families have 8 children, countries where the education system is much more sort of submissive to the role of the teacher and elders, and one that isn't. I mean, if it is a platform for thinking about what should be the minimum standard enjoyed by everybody in our society, it will have different starting points in every society, even in every community. And also, what gives energy to people to care for others will not always be the law. I mean, since when did humanity purely, the civil rights movement, yes, the language of law helped it move forward, but again, I keep referring to the previous speaker, that it's not law that animates and reaches deep into the human soul for the resources for change and inclusion. It is something more than that. So human rights needs to become more open to these different dreams and these different drivers of change, and CEDAW will resonate differently. So it is unfortunate that CEDAW has that singular meaning in Saudi Arabia, but it also has a singular meaning in the US that impoverishes many of the other things that the US would shine in under the CEDAW Convention. I must be briefer, sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to make one comment. I'm very glad that you ended up talking about the problem of national sovereignty, as of course there's that one of the famous phrases from the Baha'i teachings that talks about the chaos inherent in national sovereignty. And I just reflected on the message of the Universal House of Justice, that it was addressed to the peoples of the world. It was not addressed to the nations of the world, and it was not addressed to the United Nations. And I just thought that was very, very telling, that as far back as 30 years ago, there was this vision that we have to sort of disencumber ourselves of the burden of this sort of unbridled attachment to national sovereignty. So thank you for bringing that.
And I think a very recent example of how the public spirit is beyond the vision of politicians is the situation of migrants in Europe, that politicians that might have been not wanted to be seen dead using the word migrants say, my bedroom is open, I will welcome 10 migrants. You think, really? you wouldn't have said that last week, but good for them, that they are realizing that their reading of the public was completely wrong, and that the public is just seeing the humanity.
There's a lot of anxiety in this country, especially amongst progressive thinkers, about free trade agreements, which are becoming treaties in a different way than the United Nations ratification of different agreements. And I don't know if the U.S. has ratified all the different agreements completely, even with the Universal Declaration, and I'm not even going to mention the Earth Charter. But is there any international discussion at the UN or somewhere else addressing this issue about the so-called rights of legal people, which seem to be in these free trade agreements trumping the rights of natural people, legal people being corporate entities, etc.?
To see what we can do to learn more about how to carry on further conversations, get deeper into understanding the challenges that we face, and above all, to listen to one another in a sense that we learn from each other without always assuming, making assumptions that are maybe not always accurate or correct. So how to be open, how to be always flexible about new ideas, new perspectives, different ways of looking at the world, at the people in the world. I cannot thank the speakers enough. Those who are here, please stand up and be recognized one more time. And Professor Mitchell is in the back. due to, travel arrangements and pressures of work, others had to leave. I would also like to thank my advisory board members who have traveled far to be here. If they would please stand and be acknowledged. And of course, Ms. Bani Dugal from the Baha'i International Community, please, thank you for being with us. It's been an honor. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all the participants. Your support means a lot to the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. Thank you for being here, and we hope that you will continue to support our events, and it's been a pleasure to have you at the University of Maryland. Thank you.